Hello and welcome to Ahead of the Curve, the podcast from AcadiaSoft, where we take time to get under the skin of the margin and collateral industry, to dig deep and present topical perspectives and insights on this hugely important sector. Now here's a question. What's your view on data standardization? How much time are you putting aside to think about it? And what could the impact be for your company and our industry more widely? To put it simply, the standardization of the way the over-the-counter bilateral derivatives industry records and digitizes trade details is hugely important. But the process of achieving those methods of standardization are anything but simple. In this edition of Ahead of the Curve, we're going to examine what data standardization really means in practice. And we'll ask the crunch question, is our industry ready? To do this, I'm joined by an expert panel of guests. Donal Gallagher is Chief Executive of Quaternion Risk Management, Fred Dassori is Chief Product Officer with AcadiaSoft, and Richard Barton is Head of Product Management, also with AcadiaSoft. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks very much, John.
Thank you.
Now, before we go any further, tell me a bit about yourselves and about your roles at Quaternion and AcadiaSoft. Donal, I'll come to you first.
Thanks, John. I'm Donal Gallagher, so I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Quaternion. And for the last 10 years at Quaternion, we've been helping clients to build solutions and optimize for the complex regulations that came into force after the financial crisis. So things like the uncleared margin rules, now the LIBOR transition, the new capital rules under the Basel Accords. And at Quaternion, we're very strong advocates of transparency and open source solutions. And of course, part of that is data standards. So we're delighted to be here today.
Well, it's great to have you on board, Donal. And Fred Dassori, if I can come to you next.
Yeah, thanks, John. I've been at AcadiaSoft a little over 3 years. I'm based in New York. And as you mentioned, I'm Chief Product Officer. I'm responsible for product, for the development of AcadiaSoft's community, as well as corporate development, which includes our partnership with Quaternion. Of those areas, I think the one that's potentially unique to AcadiaSoft is the idea of community development, where we have a dedicated team focused on producing services for the industry rather than just for individual clients. And that fits well with today's topic.
It certainly does. Thank you very much indeed, Fred. And Richard Barton, finally to you.
Yeah, so I'm Richard Barton, and I head up the product management team. So we basically take the strategic ideas, strategic direction, and are responsible for delivering that. So sort of looking at those ideas and working out actually how to implement them. Part of the responsibility for my team is to understand what industry standards exist, determine if there's a need for industry standards. And we contribute into existing standardization processes and also initiate them as well.
Thank you very much indeed as well, Richard. So the three of you have got a lot of insight and knowledge on the topic that we want to discuss and talk about on this podcast. So let's get into the issue at hand, data standardization. Donal, talk us through this. The origins of much of the move towards standardization lie in the great financial crisis of 2007-08. Why does standardization matter?
That's a great question. I think standardization is part of the solution to the problem that was the great financial crisis. And one of the reasons is that it helps us avoid some of the problems that came up. Let's think a little bit about how we got here. If you remember, there was huge innovation in derivatives in the run-up to 2007. And a lot of it had to do with disaggregating risk and being able to move it around the financial system using instruments. And that's a tremendously beneficial thing from a risk management and balance sheet management perspective for the banking industry. So there were all sorts of new instrument types and in new asset classes, particularly around credit, but not exclusively, but also around interest rate and equity. And what this allowed financial institutions to do was disaggregate risk and move it from one place to another where it was probably best managed. But it also gave rise to increasing complexity. I think everyone knows about CDOs, the famous collateralized debt obligations that became one of the proximate causes of the financial crisis in 2007. But that's just one example. I've heard a number of something like 254 different derivative types, but in fact nobody actually knows because there is no comprehensive naming system for over-the-counter derivatives, which is another example of a lack of standardization. So we found, increasing complexity, layers of complexity, options sitting on top of multi-asset class, and so on. I remember distinctly being involved with a financial institution which was actually very good at managing risk, but for CDOs in particular, in which they had a large position, they had three separate systems, three different ways of representing them, and three different ways of pricing them. So even within a single financial institution, let alone across the system, there was no standardization. So it really was a question of innovation running ahead of where the industry was. And this led to surprises. I think people failed to anticipate quite a few things, and that became very clear in the financial system in the Great Crisis. One of the big failures, I think, was the failure to anticipate the huge amount of counterparty risk that was being built up by the risk transfer. So if I transfer risk from from my institution to another institution, in effect, I'm transferring an obligation, and if that obligation gets very, very large, that has a significant impact on my balance sheet, potentially my solvency, and ultimately the entire financial system, which is what happened as institutions started to fail in 2007 and brought us right to the edge of collapse, I would say, if it hadn't been for the interventions of the authorities.
So that the shock of that, then, Donald, the shock of all of that, as you say, the CDOs and the counterparty risk that was clearly at play there, that's taken us on this journey towards a call for greater standardization. That's what you're saying?
Well, very much so, because there was a big wave of regulatory response after that. If you think about some of the things that happened, the move to clearing and the uncleared margin rules for bilateral derivatives that weren't going to be cleared, things like SR 11.7 and TRIM, which were around standards for risk modeling, and the LIBOR transition, which sort of brings transparency and certainty to benchmark indices. So they were all regulatory responses and standardizations in a way. But there are still barriers out there, and we think that the standardization in the data representation of derivatives is probably one of the last barriers to be overcome. And it really will allow a new wave of interoperability, sharing, cost reduction, and ultimately safety in the industry, which I think is the most important point.
And Fred, just pursue those thoughts a little bit more for us, would you? Why standardization is so important? Why it's essentially a good thing for our industry?
Sure. Well, I'll start with maybe an anecdote to show the other side. Before joining AcadiaSoft, I worked in a fixed income electronic trading business, and counterintuitively, we felt in that business like the complexity of the market was really a competitive advantage for us. That the fact that we had the in-depth market knowledge, unique market knowledge, and the resources to exploit it made us able to operate in an environment that really kept others out, right? That stopped other firms from being able to compete effectively with us. And that is the opposite of what we are attempting to achieve at AcadiaSoft, right? AcadiaSoft is not about keeping competition out. It is about leveling the playing field to the extent we can. So for us, it's simple, right? Standardization reduces time spent on reconciliation between counterparties. Standardization eliminates disputes. And as a result, standardization drives down costs, which is ultimately what our clients like to see.
Okay, so where are we now then in all of this process? Donald, Fred, you've taken us on a journey as to why it's necessary and the potential benefits there. But how close are we to reaching an effective form of standardization that works across the industry in the way that you've just described, Fred? Richard, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think if I was equating it to sort of, a transition from childhood to being a fully functioning adult, I would say we're kind of in our teenage years at the moment. We kind of understand.
Those are difficult years, Richard. They can be very, very messy.
I know. Yeah. Well, having a couple of teenage kids myself, this is kind of why I think it's kind of fresh in my mind. But we kind of understand roughly what the rules are, but at the same time, we don't always apply by them. We don't always follow them. So I kind of feel like we're kind of at that stage. So we're not quite there yet in terms of knowing, having a set of standard ways of doing things and following those in a responsible way. We kind of know they're there, but we kind of do our own thing a little bit, right? And that's kind of what you see. So from an industry perspective, there's a number of different initiatives that are out there that have aimed at sort of standardizing OTC derivatives data. So from a perspective of trades or legal agreement data, if you look at it, maybe you had ISDA with the FPML, the financial product markup language, and more recently with the common domain model, ISDA CDM. Those have probably had most, and CDM particularly probably had most visibility and traction at the moment. And there's definitely huge opportunity there with CDM, and it's definitely something that we're collaborating with and helping to sort of move in a positive direction.
And just to clarify on CDM, Richard, you're referring to the common domain model.
That's correct, yes.
So Fred, we've got this teenager that's trying to work things out. It's a great analogy from Richard there. We're starting to grow up, starting to take things more seriously. But where are we going to go from here? How close are we getting to our teenager turning into a respectable 20-something?
Yeah, I think that to continue that analogy, how do you get the teenager when they grow up? How do you get them to leave the house? It's free to stay at home. You probably have a comfortable bed. Your mom makes you food. What gets you going? And for us, I think the exciting thing about where we are right now is that we are in terms of standardization, the industry is at an inflection point. Excuse the cliche. But with the uncleared margin rules, UMR, there's an event that's impacting all of the largest participants in the bilateral derivatives market. In order for firms to comply with UMR, they need to translate trade data into risk data, right? So there's a cross industry catalyst that is forcing firms to figure this out right now. And what's different about this event is that it affects so many firms. Many of those firms don't have resources internally to deploy on this standardization. So there are going to be fewer bespoke homegrown solutions. And what that means is that more clients are going to turn to vendors to help them solve their problems and keep their costs low. And that, by definition, means standardization.
Thank you, Fred. And Donal, as well, from your perspective at Quaternion, is this what you're seeing too?
Absolutely. Let's put some numbers on it. When the uncleared margin rules are fully enforced, there's going to be something like 1,500 of the world's largest financial firms who will be obliged to reconcile not just the value of their derivatives, but the risk in those derivatives, so the initial margin, and on a daily basis. And unless these firms can agree on exactly what the economic terms are of the underlying contracts, this is something close to an impossibility. So even small differences in something like an option expiry date or disagreements on an option expiry date expressed in different data can give rise to huge differences in the risk and failed reconciliations. And that's just not scalable to 1,500 firms. So I would say for this particular teenager that standardization is not a luxury. It's a must-have. We're obliged to go into adulthood when it comes to agreeing between all of these firms what data looks like.
Okay, Donal, thank you. Now, in essence, standardization isn't actually necessarily a new thing. There have been moves in this direction for some time, but here we are now taking much bigger steps in that direction. Richard, talk us through what AcadiaSoft has already been doing in this space.
Yeah, so I guess I would class what AcadiaSoft does sort of like practical implementation of standards. So if I kind of contrast, back before I joined AcadiaSoft, maybe back in like 2010, I worked on a standardization project, and we came up with a standard way of representing margin call exchanges between firms. It was a great definition, worked out very well, but no one uses it today. Why do people not use it today? Because there wasn't really any practical implementation of that standard. So what AcadiaSoft does is we work on standards. We look to see what's in the industry, and if there isn't anything there, we use our strong community, as Fred mentioned, to help build that. And where there is standards, we look to incorporate that into a practical implementation of it, so that we can help grow adoption of it. So a lot of the places where we run and use standardization is in where our sweet spot is, which is really the communication between firms within this industry. So if we look at AcadiaSoft, what we've built standards around and that we've been very successful on is standardizing the exchange of margin call messages and dealing with that. You're creating a mechanism for moving away from email-based communication, which is fraught with inefficiency and operational risk, and providing a more electronic way for firms to communicate around a standard representation. So we've done that with margin calls, and we've expanded that into interest statements and had a lot of success with that. We have standardized around initial margin reconciliation related to the supporting uncleared margin rules, and we've also recently been expanding that into the legal agreement space and initiated standards around agreements, and then also sort of contributing into and helping to develop the CDM representation of a legal agreement to sort of backport any enhancements which come from that industry standard with our own definition.
So Richard, doesn't sound like you've been standing still, that's for sure. Plenty that's already been in action. So as we approach the delayed phase 5 of the requirement to exchange two-way regulatory initial margin under the uncleared margin rules regulation, quite a mouthful, what does that mean for our industry? What actions will people need to take in respect of data standardization, the people that you're dealing with and working with and helping each and every day? Fred, I'm going to come to you for this.
Sure, thanks. So I think first, it's worth highlighting again the sheer number of firms in phase 5 relative to the prior phases. As Donal mentioned, there are hundreds of firms between phases 5 and 6, potentially over 1,000. The number 1,500 is frequently thrown around for reference. So it is a scale that is in a completely different proportion from phases 1 through 4, where you had roughly 20 firms in phase 1. Every phase to date has been effectively double digits, and now we're entering new territory. And so the requirements for these firms fall into two categories, which are the operational requirements that a firm needs to meet to really just to use the standard initial margin model, SIM, and then the regulatory requirements. So on the operational front, what a firm is now doing is really generating the input that drives the calculation and reconciliation of SIM IM. That input is called the CRIF file, CRIF is the Common Risk Interchange format, And what it contains is the client's positions that are subject to UMR, and then those trades' risk sensitivities. And if you look at your average buy-side firm, even fairly large firms that are subject to these rules, the sort of the larger derivatives trading buy-side organizations, they just do not have excess resources with the capacity with capacity that can be diverted to creating this daily process. On the regulatory front, what firms need to do is demonstrate that SIM is appropriate for their specific portfolios. So really showing that in this standard model, which has a number of benefits for the industry, fits specifically what their firm is doing. So there's some potential that if a firm has a particularly skewed or concentrated portfolio, that the results of P&L moves day to day are going to be would exceed what the SIM model is calibrated to compensate for. And I will leave it there and let Donal dig into some more of those details.
Thanks. Thanks, Fred. I would say the watchword here is prepare, and prepare and prepare and prepare some more. What we've seen among clients is that it really takes time to bed down the processes that feed into a good functioning daily margin exchange process. I think it's really important to start early, to get to a place where you're in a position to calculate that CRIF file that Fred talked about. That's standard common risk interchange format. So that's the file that contains the sensitivities of the trades. Get that out early, and then start the process of matching that and reconciling it with your counterparties long before you go live, because that flushes out all the things that you need operationally to be in a position to exchange margin. It's really important to have a good checklist and experience around that checklist, and things like matching trades. Do you see the same trades in the portfolio as your counterparty does? You'd be surprised how challenging that can be. Making sure that you're actually comparing apples with apples. That if, for example, down the details, if you're using crowdsourcing data, and your counterparty isn't, you can disagree on the risk buckets. It could be that you're using decomposition, but your counterparty isn't, and that'll give rise to huge differences in calculation. And ensuring things that you're looking at the same risk classes, and you've assigned things to the same risk classes. So gaining practical experience with all of those things is vital, and having a bit of runway so that you're not doing that under pressure as you're approaching the go live date. And if you need additional expertise or additional help, you're in a position to have time to get that. And finally, behind it all is are the calculations that feed into the SIM model, the standardized initial margin model, because they drive everything. So you need to gain organizational experience with what drives SIM. What drives the risk on an interest rate derivative? What drives the risk on an equity basket derivative? And finally, I would say it's exactly what Fred said. Don't forget, you can get overly focused on getting operationally ready, but you have to have compliance, which means you need to initially validate the SIM model, and then make sure it's working on an ongoing basis, whether it's through backtesting or monitoring processes, depending on your regulatory requirements. But there are ongoing monitoring processes in addition to the daily exchange, and of course around all of these things, standardization in all its various forms really help.
So I think it's fair to say that there's a fair amount there for any party in our industry to digest and think about. We're talking about scale here, we're talking about a degree of complexity, but also how important standardization is. Looking forward, and finally now, last question to you all, What are the major challenges that lie ahead? Is our industry ready for standardization? Donal, you said, businesses need to start early. They need to be thinking about this now. When you're talking to them at Quaternion, are they doing that? Is that a challenge that you're seeing that's being met, or are we some way off?
I think the industry is ready for sure. I think there's a sort of a convergence of the regulatory waves that we talked about, and the existence of utilities like AcadiaSoft. I think the centralization and the community aspects of organizations like AcadiaSoft is hugely important to facilitate that transition. And you don't have to take my word for it. Risk Magazine were recently talking about standardization, things like the CDM, and the things that will drive that are, in the words of Risk Magazine, the large infrastructure providers. So it's probably not, any one or even a number of those 1,500 firms getting together. It's actually the central infrastructure providers that will drive standardization. Go back to the main thrust of your question, John, which is, are firms ready? Yes, they're ready for standardization, but in practice, I think firms need to allow more time. I think they need to start earlier on this journey of preparedness, to allow more time for testing, to allow more time for processes to bed in, and to understand, what standardization needs to be put in place and what the benefits of it are.
Donal, thank you. Richard, what's your view? What are the major challenges that you see from your perspective at AcadiaSoft?
Yeah, I think the challenges really come down to what is the driver for moving towards standardization, right? That's one of the challenges that we see, is that we're seeing great progress in terms of standardization where there's a regulatory push, where there's a regulatory need. Where there isn't necessarily a regulatory stick there that's kind of pushing people towards automation or improvement, then there can be a bit of a slowness in sort of taking up and contributing to standardization. Now we've built up margin standardization and interest. It's over time, where they haven't necessarily initially anyway had a regulatory push. So we're seeing that a little bit with some of the other initiatives we're working on with legal agreements, for example. Right? There's a recognition that the way things are done now is not efficient, but there's a lot of other competing things going on, like the regulatory complying with regulation that sort of mean firms don't always get to working on these projects. So, what's the driver? What's the availability of time and resources to work on it? You also, I think, as Donal said, it's not easy, right? You've often got, as we've grown up, as we've been growing up and heading towards our teenage years, right? We've been doing our own thing, and it's difficult to change, right? It's difficult to sort of make that move, and there's an investment that's needed to kind of move away from internal proprietary ways of representing data to then be able to do effectively the same thing but based on a standard, and that's a challenge, kind of moving people away from that. I think where you'll see the biggest benefit, and this is where AcadiaSoft has been successful, is in the interchange between firms or between functions or systems within your organization. So where it's easier to kind of implement standards where they exist is when there's an exchange of communication between one party and another party, or one system to another system. If you can do that based on a ubiquitous language, a common way of looking at things, it's a lot easier to kind of move forward. So that's kind of where I see it. What's the regulatory driver, and how can you kind of budget and deal with a lot of competing interests.
Fred, I'll give the last word to you on this. What would you add to Richard's summary there?
I don't know if it's okay to continue beating the teenager analogy. But I'm going to go for it.
It's always a good thing. It's always they'll only answer back. They'll only answer back.
Think about it. Think about it this time from the parent's perspective. That what's required here is really a leap of faith, right? And to me, that's one of the challenges with adopting standardization, right? It's giving up control. It's seeing that adopting that, your baby's ready to leave home, and you're dealing right now with lots of firms that highly trained employees that have focused on really building out complex and therefore somewhat customized ways of representing bilateral derivatives, and you're asking them to take a leap of faith, right? To adopt a common standard for their long-term good, really to save long-term costs, and ultimately for potentially for benefits in areas that are outside of their immediate discipline, right? That said, what our answer is going to be to this question of, is the industry ready? We are in a really unique position right now where we have on the one hand, a well-defined model for OTC trade data. We also at the same time have what is an industry catalyst to spur that adoption in UMR. And we have the cost argument that standardization around one solution is by far the most efficient path forward. And we at AcadiaSoft are seeing that play out in practice. Our goal in building these services was really to eliminate the barriers to firms using SIM. And a big one of those is cost. And we've heard it come up on every front, from regulators asking us what the solution is going to cost, obviously in many client conversations. And our goal from the beginning has been to build out an efficient, standardized process that would allow any firm subject to UMR to meet its requirements at the absolute minimum cost. And so far, it looks like we've been successful. We have, with roughly 50%, potentially more of the firms in phase 5 that are expected to move margin in the first year using the standard model that we've implemented. So yes, I think it's possible, and yes, I think now's the time, and I think it's exciting for all of us, and we're looking forward really to the next 2 years to watching it play out in the industry.
Well, as you say, Fred, exciting times and a fascinating subject. Unfortunately, though, we're out of time. Donal Gallagher, Fred Dassori, and Richard Barton, thank you all very much. And thank you for listening to Ahead of the Curve. We'd like to know what you think, so please do get in touch and share your thoughts. And you can find out more about AcadiaSoft by going to www.acadiasoft.com.